October 24th, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness over the Philippine Sea carried the smell of aviation fuel and salt spray as Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M5 Zero fighter aboard the carrier Zuikaku. His hands moved through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency, checking instruments that glowed faintly in the dim cockpit. Around him, mechanics worked in controlled urgency, preparing the strike force that would launch in less than an hour. Muto was 23 years old, a combat veteran with 18 confirmed victories, and he was about to participate in what Japanese planners called Operation Sho-Go, the decisive battle that would destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. He did not know that by day's end, his squadron would lose 41 aircraft. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He did not know that he would face an enemy fighter that defied every tactical principle he had spent 3 years mastering. And he could not have imagined that within 90 minutes of launching, he would witness something that would shake his understanding of aerial combat to its foundation. A single American pilot, flying alone, systematically destroying 9 Japanese aircraft, while Japanese fighters circled helplessly below, unable to climb fast enough to intervene, unable to follow the American into his dives without their own aircraft disintegrating from structural stress. The transformation had happened so gradually that many Japanese pilots did not recognize it until too late. In December 1941, the Zero had been the finest carrier fighter in the world. By October 1944, it had become a death trap, and the weapon that exposed this brutal reality was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, an aircraft that killed 19 Japanese planes for every Hellcat lost. For pilots like Muto, who had been trained to believe in the Zero's invincibility, the numbers seemed impossible. They were not impossible. They were inevitable. The morning of December 7th, 1941 began with a revelation that would define Japanese naval aviation for the next 6 months. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the first wave of 360 aircraft toward Pearl Harbor, watched as Zero fighters swept through American defenses with an ease that seemed almost casual. The Americans had Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and a few Wildcats that managed to get airborne. Against the Zero, they were target practice. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Shiga, flying combat air patrol over the strike force, encountered 4 Wildcats attempting to intercept Japanese bombers. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. Shiga's Zero could turn inside the American fighters so tightly that the Wildcats could not bring their guns to bear. When the Americans tried to dive away, the Zero's superior climb rate allowed Shiga to pursue them back to altitude. All 4 Wildcats went down. Shiga returned to the carrier Akagi without a single bullet hole in his aircraft. The Pearl Harbor attack validated everything Japanese naval aviation believed about the Zero. The fighter had been designed by Jiro Horikoshi with a singular obsession: performance at any cost. The aircraft weighed approximately 5,300 pounds fully loaded, achieved through ruthless weight reduction. No armor plating protected the pilot. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing, trading safety for range and reduced weight. The airframe used minimum structural material, just enough strength for anticipated loads with zero safety margin. These compromises created an aircraft that could reach speeds of 331 miles per hour, climb to 19,680 feet in 7.5 minutes, and execute turns that would leave any Allied fighter struggling to maintain visual contact. The Zero's range exceeded 1,900 miles, enabling it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory or patrol vast ocean expanses. In early 1942, this combination of speed, range, and maneuverability was unmatched. Japanese pilots trained to exploit these advantages through a combat doctrine called dogfight maneuvering, emphasizing tight turns, energy conservation through efficient movement, and positioning through superior agility. The training was brutal. Pilots spent thousands of hours perfecting aerobatics, learning to sense their aircraft's limits through feel rather than instruments. They practiced combat maneuvers until the Zero felt like an extension of their own body. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's third-ranking ace with 64 confirmed victories, described the Zero in his memoir as an aircraft that responded to thoughts rather than control inputs. In a properly executed turn, Sakai wrote, the Zero would rotate around an invisible point in space, while the enemy fighter would skid outward, bleeding energy. A skilled pilot could complete a full circle before an American fighter completed 3/4 of a turn. This superiority was not theoretical. It was demonstrated in combat after combat during the first 6 months of the Pacific War. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Zero fighters from carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku destroyed 33 American aircraft, while losing only 19 of their own. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Zeros shot down 20 American fighters for the loss of 12 Japanese aircraft. The mathematics seemed to favor Japan. American pilots developed a healthy respect for the Zero that bordered on fear. Wildcat pilots, returning from early engagements, reported that the Japanese fighter could outclimb, outturn, and outrange anything the Navy fielded. Flight manuals began including defensive tactics, specifically designed around the assumption that the Zero was superior in every performance category, except straight-line speed and diving ability. The official American tactic when surprised by Zeros was to dive away and run. This was not cowardice, it was pragmatic acknowledgement of reality. But for Japanese pilots, this early dominance created a dangerous psychological foundation. The Zero was not invincible. It was simply better than what it faced in late 1941 and early 1942. The aircraft had critical vulnerabilities that would prove fatal once American designers understood them and created a fighter specifically optimized to exploit those weaknesses. The warning signs appeared as early as June 1942, but most Japanese pilots did not recognize them for what they were. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was Japan's first major defeat, but the carrier aircraft losses were attributed to tactical errors and bad luck rather than any fundamental flaw in the Zero itself. Japanese pilots noted that in fighter versus fighter combat, the Zero still dominated. What they failed to recognize was that American pilots were beginning to adapt. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's Weave defense, developed specifically to counter the Zero's turning advantage, allowed Wildcat pilots to survive encounters they would have lost individually. The tactic was crude and defensive, but it worked. More ominously, some American pilots were beginning to refuse traditional dogfights entirely, using hit-and-run tactics that leveraged the Wildcat's superior armor and firepower against the Zero's fragility. These were isolated incidents in mid-1942, easily dismissed by Japanese aviators as American cowardice or desperation. They were neither. They were reconnaissance, American pilots probing for weaknesses, learning what worked and what did not, preparing for a new fighter that would make those tactical lessons devastatingly effective. July 10, 1942. Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, 19 years old, made an emergency landing on Akutan Island in the Aleutians after his Zero's oil return line was severed by ground fire. The marshy terrain, which appeared solid from altitude, was actually a bog concealed beneath knee-deep grass. Koga's landing gear caught in the soft mud, and the lightweight fighter flipped violently upside down. The impact snapped Koga's neck instantly. His wingmen circled the crash site multiple times, reluctant to destroy what appeared to be an intact aircraft on the chance their comrade had survived. They eventually departed without firing, their fuel running low. For 5 weeks, Koga's Zero sat undisturbed in the Aleutian wilderness, hidden in a small valley that received perhaps 6 days of clear visibility per month through perpetual fog. Then, on July 10, 1942, an American PBY Catalina patrol bomber spotted the distinctive red circles on the Zero's wings through a temporary break in the weather. The recovery operation took 3 weeks of backbreaking labor, constructing a makeshift road to extract the fighter from the bog. By late August, the captured Zero had arrived at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where it was restored to flying condition in just 41 days. On September 20, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders became the first American pilot to fly an intact Zero. What he discovered during 24 test flights over the following month would fundamentally change American fighter tactics and influence the design refinements of an aircraft already under development. Sanders found that above 200 knots, approximately 230 miles per hour, the Zero's fabric-covered ailerons became increasingly heavy and unresponsive, requiring enormous stick force to overcome. American fighters with metal-covered control surfaces and hydraulic assistance maintained full control authority at all speeds. Sanders discovered a second critical weakness during negative acceleration maneuvers, when he pushed the stick forward sharply, inducing negative gravitational forces. The Zero's engine coughed and died. The float-type carburetor, designed for positive and zero-gravity conditions, could not maintain fuel flow during sustained negative acceleration. The engine would restart when positive acceleration resumed, but for several seconds, the Zero became a powerless glider. These discoveries were compiled into detailed reports distributed throughout the fleet with unprecedented speed. For the first time, American pilots had concrete knowledge of how to fight the Zero and win. The information arrived at a critical moment for Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, which was finalizing production details for the F6F Hellcat. The basic design predated Koga's crash, with the first prototype flying on June 26, 1942, 8 days before Koga's fatal landing. But the captured Zero's technical data allowed Grumman engineers to refine the F6F's final configuration, ensuring it could exploit every Zero weakness Sanders had identified. The Hellcat would have hydraulically boosted, metal-covered ailerons that maintained control authority at all speeds. Its pressure carburetor would continue running under negative acceleration. Its structure would handle 9G positive and 6G negative acceleration, far exceeding the Zero's structural limits of approximately 5G maximum. Most importantly, the F6F would be powered by a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, giving it overwhelming power advantages that could compensate for its greater weight. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for performance, the F6F would provide both, using raw power to overcome the weight penalty of armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structure. By October 1942, the first production F6F3 made its maiden flight, just 2 weeks after Sanders completed his initial test flights in the captured Zero. The timing was not coincidental. Production had been deliberately delayed until engineers could incorporate the latest intelligence. The F6F began reaching fleet squadrons in early 1943. Japanese intelligence officers heard reports of a new American fighter entering service, but initial assessments dismissed it as merely an improved Wildcat. The Zero had faced newer American fighters before, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, and maintained its combat effectiveness through superior pilot skill and the aircraft's fundamental maneuverability advantages. There was no reason to believe this new Grumman fighter would be different. The first Japanese pilots to encounter Hellcats in combat did not immediately recognize what they were facing. August 31, 1943, Marcus Island. Aircraft from Fighting Squadrons 5 and 9, operating from carriers Yorktown and Independence, attacked Japanese installations in the first combat test of the F6F. The engagement was brief and one-sided. Japanese fighters that managed to get airborne found themselves outmatched in every performance category except low-speed turning. But that single advantage proved insufficient. Hellcat pilots simply refused to engage in turning fights, using speed and altitude to dictate engagement terms. The Americans would dive, make a single firing pass, then climb back to altitude before Zero pilots could respond. 2 Hellcats were lost to anti-aircraft fire, but in air-to-air combat, the F6F demonstrated immediate superiority. The reports from Marcus Island reached Japanese Naval Aviation Headquarters with details that should have triggered alarm. American pilots were using vertical tactics, diving through Japanese formations at speeds the Zero could not match, then climbing away before defenders could pursue. but the scale was too small to draw broader conclusions. Marcus Island was a minor engagement, easily attributed to local circumstances or pilot error. The patterns would need to repeat across multiple battles before Japanese commanders recognized they were facing a systematic, tactical, and technological shift. That recognition would come too late. By the time Japanese naval aviation understood what the Hellcat represented, American production had already created an insurmountable numerical advantage to complement the F6F's technical superiority. November 23, 1943. The sky over Tarawa was cloudless, offering perfect visibility for what would become the first major test between Zeros and Hellcats. 30 Zero fighters from the carrier-based units rose to intercept American strike aircraft attacking the Gilbert Islands. F6F Hellcats from carrier Essex engaged the Japanese fighters in a battle that raged across the invasion beaches below. When the engagement ended, American pilots claimed 30 Japanese fighters destroyed for the loss of a single F6F. Lieutenant Junior Grade Yoshio Fukui survived the Tarawa engagement, one of only 11 Zero pilots who returned to their carriers. In his combat report, filed aboard the carrier Zuikaku, Fukui described tactics he had never encountered before. The American fighters attacked from high altitude, diving at tremendous speed. When we turned to engage, they were already climbing away. Our aircraft could not follow them into the dive without the controls becoming dangerously heavy. When we tried to climb after them, they climbed faster. We could not force them to fight on our terms. Fukui's report included a detail that naval aviation staff officers in Tokyo found difficult to believe. He estimated the American fighters were diving at speeds exceeding 420 knots, approximately 480 miles per hour. At those speeds, Fukui noted, the Zero's ailerons became almost immovable, making any defensive role nearly impossible. The American pilots appeared to understand this limitation and exploited it ruthlessly. They would dive, fire a short burst, then roll hard to the right at speeds where Japanese pilots simply could not follow. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack and now serving as Air Operations Officer for the Carrier Division, read Fukui's report with growing concern. The described tactics were not random or spontaneous. They were systematic, suggesting American pilots had been specifically trained to exploit known weaknesses in the Zero's high-speed handling. Genda requested additional combat reports from other units that had engaged the new American fighter. The pattern was consistent across all encounters. Hellcat pilots refused to engage in traditional turning fights. They maintained altitude advantage whenever possible. They attacked in high-speed dives that Japanese fighters could not follow. And they used coordinated team tactics that prevented Japanese pilots from isolating individual targets. Most troubling was the kill ratio. Across all engagements in November and December 1943, Japanese units were losing approximately 3 aircraft for every American fighter destroyed. This was dramatically worse than the roughly even exchange rates Zeros had maintained against Wildcats earlier in the war. Genda's analysis identified the core problem. The Hellcat was not simply a better aircraft. It was specifically optimized to negate the Zero's advantages while exploiting its limitations. The American fighter was heavier, less maneuverable, and could not win a traditional dogfight against a Zero of equal altitude and energy state. But Hellcat pilots never fought that battle. They fought from above, using altitude as stored energy that could be converted to devastating speed during attack runs. The Zero's superior turning ability became irrelevant when combat occurred in vertical space rather than horizontal. The captured Zero that American pilots had been flying since September 1942 had revealed every weakness, and the Hellcats' design and tactical employment reflected that knowledge with surgical precision. Japanese naval aviation faced a crisis. The Zero had been designed for a specific type of combat, and American pilots had changed the rules of engagement. Replacing the Zero with a new fighter design would take years. Developing new tactics to counter the Hellcat's vertical attacks required pilot training that Japan's shrinking fuel reserves and instructor base could not support. The strategic situation was deteriorating faster than Japanese aviation could adapt. American industrial production was creating an overwhelming numerical advantage. By late 1943, the United States was producing fighters at rates Japan simply could not match. Grumman's Bethpage facility was manufacturing Hellcats at peak production of 644 aircraft per month. Japan's entire aviation industry produced fewer than 1,000 fighters monthly across all types. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics were brutal. Even if Japanese pilots achieved equal kill ratios, which they were not, American losses would be replaced within weeks, while Japanese losses were increasingly irreplaceable. The experienced pilot base that had begun the war was being eroded through attrition that could not be replaced. Training programs were abbreviated as fuel shortages mounted and experienced instructors died in combat. By late 1943, new Japanese pilots were entering combat with perhaps one-third the flight hours American aviators received. The experience differential, combined with the F6F's technical superiority, created a death spiral. Every engagement cost Japan irreplaceable pilots, while American losses were quickly replaced by a training pipeline producing thousands of new aviators annually. Lieutenant Takeo Tanemizu, assigned to the carrier Shokaku's fighter squadron in January 1944, represented this new generation of Japanese pilots. He had completed flight training with approximately 250 hours total flight time, less than half what pilots received in 1941. His combat training consisted largely of aerobatic practice and gunnery against towed targets. He had never practiced high-altitude interceptions, never trained against tactics that emphasized vertical attacks, never learned energy management techniques for combat against faster, more powerful fighters. When Tanemizu flew his first combat mission in February 1944, intercepting American bombers attacking Truk, he encountered Hellcats for the first time. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. Tanemizu's section of 4 Zeros was jumped by 6 F6Fs that dove from 22,000 feet. The American fighters appeared so suddenly that Tanemizu barely registered their presence before his wingman's aircraft exploded in a ball of flame. He instinctively turned hard left, the defensive maneuver he had practiced hundreds of times in training. The Zero responded beautifully, pivoting through a tight arc that would have defeated any Wildcat. But the Hellcat that had attacked his wingman did not try to follow the turn. It continued its dive, disappearing below Tanemizu's aircraft before he could bring his guns to bear. 3 seconds later, it reappeared, climbing vertically past his altitude with enough speed to zoom another 3,000 feet above him. Tanemizu pushed his throttle forward and pulled back on the stick, trying to follow. His Zero climbed, but the Hellcat climbed faster, its massive engine providing performance that seemed physically impossible for its size. By the time Tanemizu reached the Hellcat's previous altitude, the American fighter was already rolling into another attack dive. The entire engagement followed this pattern. Hellcats diving, firing, climbing away before Tanemizu could respond. His section lost 3 aircraft in 4 minutes without scoring a single hit on the Americans. Tanemizu returned to Shokaku, shaken, struggling to describe what he had experienced. The American pilots had never given him an opportunity to use his aircraft's advantages. They had fought in 3 dimensions, while his training had prepared him for 2. Combat reports from early 1944 began, including a phrase that would become increasingly common in Japanese aviation circles: vertical superiority. Pilots described feeling helpless as American fighters attacked from above with impunity, diving through Japanese formations at speeds that made interception impossible, then climbing back to attacking positions before defenders could organize a response. The psychological impact was devastating. Zero pilots had spent years believing their aircraft was superior, their training more rigorous, their tactics more refined. Now they were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that refused to fight the type of combat Japanese doctrine emphasized. The mystique of the Zero, carefully cultivated through 3 years of successful operations, was crumbling. By March 1944, Some Japanese pilots were developing what American intelligence would later call zero fatigue, a recognition that engaging Hellcats would likely prove fatal. Pilots began avoiding combat when possible, diving away into clouds or fleeing toward friendly anti-aircraft coverage rather than pressing attacks. This defensive mentality was catastrophic for an offensive weapon like naval aviation. Fighters that would not fight could not defend their bombers, could not contest American air superiority, could not prevent enemy strikes against Japanese carriers and support vessels. The operational impact rippled through every engagement. American carrier groups began operating with near impunity, knowing Japanese air opposition would be minimal and ineffective. The statistics told a story that Japanese commanders found almost impossible to accept. In the first 6 months of Hellcat operations, from August 1943 through January 1944, the kill ratio had climbed to approximately 7-1. 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. These were numbers that defied everything Japanese naval aviation understood about fighter combat, but the numbers would get worse. Much worse. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto sat in his Zero aboard the carrier Zuikaku as the pre-dawn briefing concluded. Today was the day Japanese planners had been preparing for since the catastrophic losses at Midway 2 years earlier. Operation Sho-Go would commit every available carrier, every trained pilot, every serviceable aircraft to destroying the American invasion fleet attacking Saipan. 9 Japanese carriers would launch coordinated strikes against 15 American carriers of Task Force 58. The plan assumed that Japanese land-based aircraft from Guam and other Marianas bases would coordinate with carrier strikes, overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers. It assumed that Japanese pilots, though less experienced than the pre-war generation, could still achieve favorable exchange rates against American fighters. It assumed the Zero still possessed advantages that could be exploited through superior tactics. Every assumption was wrong. The first Japanese strike wave launched at 8:30 that morning. 69 aircraft, a mix of Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers, and Zero escorts, headed toward the American fleet 100 miles to the east. They were detected by American radar at a range of 150 miles, giving Hellcat pilots on combat air patrol ample time to position themselves for interception. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from USS Essex, climbed to 24,000 feet with his fighters, positioning between the incoming strike and the Sunday. The Japanese formation flew approximately 12,000 feet, their pilots focused on reaching the American carriers, watching for enemy fighters at their altitude or below. They were not watching above. The Hellcats dove. Lieutenant Muto, flying escort position on the strike formation's right flank, saw tracers slashing through the sky before he registered where they came from. A Judy ahead of him exploded, its fuel tanks igniting in a fireball that consumed the aircraft in seconds. Then another, then 2 more in rapid succession. He pulled back hard on his stick, trying to gain altitude and engage the attackers, but the Hellcats were already diving away, building speed that made pursuit hopeless. By the time Muto's Zero climbed 1,000 feet, the American fighters were already 3,000 feet below him, accelerating away in near-vertical dives. His engine screamed at full power, but the Zero's climb rate, once its greatest advantage, could not match the Hellcat's ability to convert altitude into speed and then speed back into altitude through sheer engine power. The first wave lost 42 aircraft before reaching the American fleet. The remaining 27 that penetrated to the carriers accomplished nothing, facing a storm of anti-aircraft fire and additional Hellcat patrols. Only 27 aircraft from the original 69 returned to their carriers. Muto was among the survivors, his Zero untouched by enemy fire because he had never gotten close enough to engage. He had simply watched, helpless, as American fighters destroyed his formation from positions of complete tactical superiority. The second strike wave launched at 11:45, 107 aircraft in a massive formation that Japanese commanders believed could overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. They were wrong. The second wave was detected even earlier, at 160 miles. Hellcat pilots had time to position themselves with perfect geometric advantage, stacking at various altitudes from 18,000 to 26,000 feet, creating layers of interception that the Japanese strike would have to penetrate. What followed was systematic destruction. The Hellcats attacked in coordinated sections, diving through the Japanese formation from multiple angles, firing short bursts that sent bombers spiraling into the ocean, then climbing away before Zero escorts could respond. The Japanese formation began to disintegrate, bombers breaking formation to evade, fighters scattering to engage attackers who were never where they appeared to be. Of 107 aircraft in the second wave, only 10 returned to their carriers. 97 aircraft lost. The majority shot down by Hellcats before they could even sight the American fleet. The psychological impact on surviving pilots was catastrophic. They had flown into what felt like an ambush choreographed by an enemy who knew exactly where they would be and exactly how to kill them, which of course was precisely what had happened. American radar provided advance warning. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to optimal intercept positions, and the pilots executed vertical attack doctrine with mechanical precision. Lieutenant Muto flew in the third strike wave, launched in early afternoon. By this point, Japanese carriers were launching aircraft in near desperation, throwing every flyable machine at the Americans in hopes that sheer persistence would overwhelm their defenses. Muto's formation of 67 aircraft suffered the same fate as the previous waves. Hellcats appeared from above, diving at speeds that made them nearly impossible to track visually, firing devastating bursts from their 650 caliber machine guns, then climbing away before Zero pilots could react. Muto watched his squadron leader's aircraft disintegrate in mid-air, struck by a burst that lasted perhaps 1 second but delivered 80 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition into the Zero's unarmored fuel tanks. The fighter simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding cloud of burning aviation fuel and wreckage. This time, Muto tried something different. When the Hellcats dove, he dove too, pushing his Zero into the steepest descent he dared attempt. He would follow the American fighters down, accepting whatever speed they built, and attack them during their pullout when they would be vulnerable. It was a desperate tactic born from watching 2 previous strikes annihilated. It failed. At 350 knots, Muto's Zero began to shake violently. The fabric-covered ailerons were ballooning from air pressure, and the control stick felt like it was embedded in concrete. He could barely move it. When he tried to pull out of the dive, the structural loading felt as though the wings would separate from the fuselage. He leveled off at 8,000 feet, his entire aircraft vibrating from the stress, and watched the Hellcats he had been pursuing pull out of their dives at speeds that must have exceeded 420 knots. They simply flew away, accelerating in level flight to speeds his Zero could not match, then pulling up into climbs that carried them back to 20,000 feet in less than a minute. Muto's engine was screaming at full power, but he was climbing at perhaps 1,500 feet per minute. The Hellcats were climbing at over 3,000 feet per minute. By the time he reached 15,000 feet, they were already at 23,000, repositioning for another attack. He was not fighting pilots, he was fighting physics, and physics was winning. Of the 67 aircraft in the third wave, 15 returned. Throughout the day, Japanese carriers launched 374 aircraft in multiple strike waves. Only 130 returned. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The experienced pilots who had rebuilt the carrier air groups after Midway were dead. The carefully hoarded aircraft were gone. The tactical doctrine that had served Japan well in 1941 and early 42 had been rendered obsolete by an enemy who refused to fight that type of combat. American losses were 23 to 30 aircraft, with many pilots rescued from the ocean. The kill ratio for the battle was approximately 16 to 1, but that number, devastating as it was, did not capture the complete picture. Many Japanese aircraft lost were bombers, not fighters. In fighter versus fighter engagements specifically, the ratio was closer to 20-1. 20 Zeros destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air combat. Commander Minoru Genda, observing the catastrophe from the carrier Taiho before it was torpedoed and sank that afternoon, understood immediately that Japanese naval aviation had suffered a defeat from which it could never recover. The carriers could be replaced, the aircraft could be manufactured, but the pilots, the experienced aviators who understood combat at an instinctive level, were irreplaceable, and they were gone. In his after-action report, filed from the carrier Zuikaku after Taiho's sinking, Genda wrote with brutal honesty about what had destroyed Japanese aviation. The American fighter was not simply superior in performance. It was employed with tactics that systematically negated every advantage the Zero possessed. Japanese pilots were trained for horizontal combat, turning fights where agility mattered. The Americans fought vertically, where power and structural strength dominated. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual skill and aircraft performance. American doctrine emphasized coordinated team tactics and energy management. The combination was unbeatable. Genda recommended immediate changes to Japanese fighter tactics, emphasizing altitude superiority and vertical maneuvers. But his recommendations required advanced training that Japan's fuel situation no longer permitted, and aircraft performance that the Zero simply could not provide. The report was filed and largely ignored. There were no solutions available that could change the fundamental equation. Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea, one of fewer than 140 pilots who returned from the day's operations. In his personal diary, recovered after the war, Muto wrote about what he had witnessed. "We were told the enemy was developing better fighters, but we believed our superior training and the Zero's agility would allow us to prevail. We were wrong. The American pilots do not fight the battle we trained for. They attack from positions we cannot reach, at speeds we cannot match, using tactics we have no counter for. The Zero can still turn inside their fighters, but they never turn. They dive, they shoot, they climb away, and we die." Muto's diary included calculations he had worked out, trying to understand the performance differential. He estimated, based on observation, that the Hellcat climbed approximately twice as fast as his Zero above 15,000 feet. It could dive safely at speeds at least 70 knots faster, and its engine provided enough power that it could sustain climbs that would cause a Zero's engine to overheat or lose power. The numbers meant that in any engagement initiated by the Americans, they held every advantage, and they initiated every engagement. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots extended beyond individual fear. It represented the collapse of a fundamental belief system. For 3 years, Zero pilots had been taught that their aircraft was superior, their training more rigorous, their spirit indomitable. The Americans were portrayed as soft, undisciplined, lacking the warrior mentality that defined Japanese naval aviation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea shattered these comfortable myths. The Americans were not soft, they were ruthlessly efficient, employing their technological advantages with systematic precision. Their pilots were not undisciplined. They were executing complex coordinated tactics that required extensive training and strict adherence to doctrine. And spirit, the indomitable fighting spirit that Japanese culture celebrated, meant nothing when you could not reach your enemy to fight him. By July 1944, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed as an offensive force. The carriers that survived the Philippine Sea had aircraft but no experienced pilots to fly them. Training programs were producing new aviators, but they were entering combat with minimal preparation against an enemy that had refined its tactics to near perfection. The kill ratios continued to worsen. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Hellcat pilots achieved the war's most lopsided results. Over 4 days of combat, American fighters shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 16 Hellcats in air-to-air combat. That is approximately 19-1, the ratio that would define the F6F's combat record. 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost. Commander David McCampbell's mission on October 24 exemplified how completely American tactical doctrine had evolved. Flying alone after his wingman departed with fuel concerns, McCampbell engaged a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. Over 90 minutes, he shot down 9 aircraft, using vertical attacks that gave the Japanese no opportunity to employ their numerical advantage. He would dive from 23,000 feet, fire a 2-second burst, then climb back to attacking altitude before the enemy formation could respond. 9 kills, 0 damage to his aircraft, fighting alone against 60. It was not luck. It was physics and tactics applied with surgical precision against an enemy that had no counter. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with McCampbell and other top Hellcat aces reported similar experiences. The Americans attacked from positions that made defense impossible. They never stayed at low altitude where the Zero's turning ability could be employed. They used their aircraft strengths, power, and structural durability to dominate combat in vertical space, and they worked in coordinated teams that prevented Japanese pilots from isolating individual targets. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ito, flying from the carrier Chitose during Leyte Gulf operations, wrote in his combat report about an engagement that captured the helplessness Japanese pilots felt. 6 Zeros encountered 4 Hellcats escorting American bombers. The Hellcats immediately climbed to altitude, positioning above the Japanese fighters. When Ito's section attacked the bombers, the Hellcats dove, destroying 2 Zeros in the initial pass. The remaining 4 Zeros turned to engage, but the Hellcats had already climbed back above them. The engagement continued for nearly 8 minutes, with Hellcats making repeated diving attacks while the Zeros circled below, unable to climb fast enough to intercept, unable to dive after the Americans without risking structural failure. Eventually, 2 more Zeros were shot down. Ito and 1 other pilot survived by diving away and fleeing at wave-top level toward friendly anti-aircraft coverage. They had never fired their guns. The Americans had controlled every aspect of the engagement from start to finish. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were openly discussing the futility of engaging Hellcats. Captured documents from this period, particularly training materials and tactical memoranda, showed Japanese aviation leadership struggling to develop effective counters. One document, translated by American intelligence in November 1944, instructed pilots to maintain constant vigilance above and to never assume altitude superiority. But these were defensive recommendations, survival tips rather than offensive doctrine. Another document recommended that Zero pilots should attempt to drag Hellcats into prolonged turning fights at low altitude where the Japanese fighters' agility advantages could be employed. The recommendation revealed how completely Japanese tacticians misunderstood the situation. Hellcat pilots were not accidentally being drawn into favorable positions. They were deliberately refusing unfavorable engagements. No amount of Japanese maneuvering could force an American pilot to fight at low altitude if he chose not to. The structural and performance advantages meant that Hellcats could always disengage, always reset the fight on their terms. Japanese aviation had no answer. The industrial disparity compounded the tactical hopelessness. By late 1944, the United States was producing Hellcats at rates that seemed impossible to Japanese planners who understood their own nation's industrial limitations. Grumman's single factory complex was manufacturing over 600 aircraft monthly. Japan's entire aviation industry produced approximately 800 to 1,000 fighters per month across all types. American losses, even at unfavorable exchange rates, would be replaced within weeks. Japanese losses were permanent. The pilot shortage was even more severe. American training programs were producing thousands of new aviators annually, each receiving extensive flight time and tactical instruction. Japanese training had collapsed under fuel shortages and instructor losses. By late 1944, new Japanese pilots were entering combat with as little as 100 flight hours total, less than half what American pilots received, and a fraction of what Japanese pilots had received in 1941. The experience gap, combined with the technical and tactical advantages the Hellcat provided, created engagements that were less combat than execution. Inexperienced Japanese pilots, flying an outclassed aircraft, facing veteran American aviators who had refined their tactics through hundreds of combat missions. The mathematics were inevitably fatal. Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto died on November 11, 1944, during an engagement off Luzon. His Zero was one of 15 Japanese fighters attempting to intercept an American strike group. They were engaged by 12 Hellcats at 20,000 feet. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 14 Zeros were destroyed. 1 escaped. American losses were 0. Muto's aircraft was seen diving vertically with smoke trailing from the engine, either from battle damage or from structural failure during a high-speed maneuver. His body was never recovered. He was 23 years old, a veteran of 18 months of combat, and he died in an aircraft that had become obsolete through no fault of its design, but through the systematic exploitation of its limitations by an enemy that understood it better than its own pilots did. The final kill ratio for the F6F Hellcat against all Japanese aircraft types in the Pacific was 19-1. 5,163 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat by Navy and Marine Hellcat pilots, with only 270 Hellcats lost to enemy fighters. Against Zeros specifically, the ratio was approximately 13-1, still a catastrophically one-sided result that reflected not just superior aircraft but superior tactics, superior training, and superior industrial capacity. For Japanese pilots, the numbers represented the collapse of everything they had believed about aerial combat. The Zero had been the finest carrier fighter in the world in December 1941. By November 1944, it was a liability that killed the men who flew it. The transformation happened not because the Zero became worse, but because the Americans had created a fighter specifically optimized to exploit its weaknesses and had developed tactics that made those weaknesses fatal. Japanese aviation officers who survived the war and wrote about their experiences consistently returned to the same theme. The Hellcat itself was not invincible. It could be shot down. It had limitations. But American pilots never fought in ways that exposed those limitations. They fought vertically when Japanese doctrine emphasized horizontal combat. They used team tactics when Japanese training emphasized individual skill. They leveraged industrial advantages that allowed them to replace losses while Japanese aviation withered from attrition. Saburo Sakai, Japan's third-ranking ace who survived the war, wrote in his memoir about the psychological impact of facing Hellcats in late 1944. In early combat, he wrote, "We believed our superior spirit and the Zero's performance would allow us to overcome American material advantages. By 1944, we understood that spirit was meaningless when you could not reach your enemy. The Americans had built a fighter that made our advantages irrelevant and exploited our weaknesses ruthlessly. We were not defeated by better pilots. We were defeated by better thinking." The Akutan Zero's capture in July 1942 had provided Americans with detailed knowledge of the Zero's performance envelope, control characteristics, and structural limits. That intelligence arrived at precisely the moment when Grumman was finalizing the F6F's design, allowing engineers to ensure their fighter could exploit every weakness. The tactical doctrine that Hellcat pilots employed, vertical attacks, high-speed diving passes, refusal to engage in turning fights, was developed directly from Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders's test flights in the captured Zero during September and October 1942. American pilots knew the Zero's ailerons locked up above 230 miles per hour. They knew its engine quit under negative acceleration. They knew its structure could not handle the G-loads of high-speed maneuvers. They knew these things because they had captured an intact example, tested it exhaustively, and distributed the findings throughout the fleet. Japanese pilots, by contrast, never fully understood the Hellcat's capabilities. They knew it was faster and more powerful, but they did not grasp how completely American tactics had been built around exploiting specific performance advantages. Japanese intelligence never captured an intact Hellcat for testing until very late in the war, by which point the information was operationally useless. The asymmetry of information was as important as the asymmetry of performance. American pilots fought with complete knowledge of their enemy's limitations. Japanese pilots fought blind, learning through fatal trial and error what Americans had discovered through systematic testing. The legacy of the 19-to-1 kill ratio extended far beyond World War II. It became the benchmark against which all subsequent American fighter aircraft were measured. Could it achieve dominance comparable to the Hellcat? Could it turn technological advantages into tactical supremacy as effectively? The 15 Eagle, which compiled an 85-to-0 kill ratio in Israeli service and over 100 kills without a single loss in American operations, was consciously designed using lessons learned from the F6F's success. Superior engine power, robust structure, advanced sensors for situational awareness, and tactics built around exploiting specific advantages. The F-22 Raptor's development emphasized similar principles. Overwhelming power through supercruise capability, structural strength for high-G maneuvering, stealth for positional advantage equivalent to the Hellcat's altitude superiority, and tactics emphasizing engagement control. Every American fighter developed since 1945 has incorporated DNA from the Hellcat's systematic dominance. But for Japanese pilots who faced Hellcat's combat, the legacy was more immediate and more painful. They had flown the world's finest carrier fighter and watched it become obsolete within 2 years. They had been trained to believe in their superiority and learned through catastrophic losses that technological and tactical advantages matter more than spirit or skill. They had fought an enemy that refused to fight fair, that leveraged every advantage while exposing none of its weaknesses, that turned combat into a systematic execution rather than a contest of equals. The 19-to-1 kill ratio was not a statistic. It was the quantified result of everything that went wrong for Japanese naval aviation after Midway. The loss of experienced pilots who could not be replaced, the fuel shortages that prevented adequate training, the industrial limitations that could not match American production, the tactical rigidity that could not adapt to new forms of combat, and most fundamentally, the Zero itself, an aircraft designed for the war Japan thought it would fight, rather than the war it actually faced. American pilots who flew Hellcats spoke about the aircraft with affection bordering on reverence. It was stable, predictable, forgiving of mistakes. It had no bad habits, no tricky characteristics that could kill unwary pilots. It was fast enough to control engagement terms, but not so fast that inexperienced pilots lost control. It climbed well, dove safely, and handled battle damage that would destroy lesser aircraft. It was, in many ways, the perfect weapon for the war America needed to fight. Mass-produced, easy to fly, optimized for the pilot skills available rather than demanding exceptional talent. Japanese pilots who survived to fly against Hellcats spoke about the aircraft with something approaching despair. It represented everything they could not match. Power they could not overcome, structure they could not compromise, tactics they could not counter, production they could not equal. The Hellcat was not invincible. Individual aircraft were shot down, pilots made mistakes, but the system, the combination of aircraft, tactics, training, and industrial support, was unbeatable given Japan's circumstances in 1944 and 45. The final irony was that the Zero itself had been a revolutionary aircraft when introduced. It had represented a similar leap over its opponents in 1941 as the Hellcat represented over the Zero in 1944. The difference was that Japan, lacking America's industrial capacity and pilot training infrastructure, could not adapt or replace the Zero when its vulnerabilities were exposed. American aviation, by contrast, moved from the Wildcat to the Hellcat to the Corsair in rapid succession, each generation incorporating lessons learned and addressing previous weaknesses. By August 1945, when the war ended, the F6F Hellcat had compiled the most successful combat record of any American fighter in history. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed. 19 Japanese aircraft shot down for every Hellcat lost in combat. These numbers represented not just technical superiority, but systematic exploitation of known enemy weaknesses, rigorous training that prepared pilots for the specific combat they would face, tactics built around aircraft strengths rather than trying to match enemy capabilities, and industrial production that ensured numerical superiority complemented technical advantages. For the Japanese pilots, who could not believe the 19-to-1 kill ratio, their disbelief reflected a deeper failure to understand how completely the nature of aerial combat had changed. The war they had trained for, the war the Zero was designed to fight, was over by mid-1943. The new war, fought in vertical space by pilots who used physics as a weapon and refused engagements they could not win, required different aircraft, different training, and different tactics. Japan could provide none of these things in sufficient quantity or quality to change the outcome. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of superior intelligence, superior design, superior tactics, and superior resources, applied with systematic precision against an enemy that never fully understood what was killing them. The story of Japanese Zero pilots facing F6F Hellcats is ultimately a story about the limits of courage and skill when confronting overwhelming systematic advantages. Japanese aviators were not cowards. They were not incompetent. They flew their aircraft to its limits and beyond, achieving individual feats of extraordinary bravery. But bravery could not overcome the fundamental equation. Their aircraft could not fight where the enemy fought. Their tactics could not force engagements on favorable terms. Their training could not match the preparation American pilots received. And their industrial base could not replace the losses they suffered. In the end, the 19-to-1 kill ratio represented the quantified difference between two nations' approach to aerial warfare. One designed the perfect aircraft for the war they imagined. The other designed a good enough aircraft for the war they actually faced, then refined it through systematic intelligence gathering, tactical innovation, and industrial capacity that could absorb losses and continue fighting. The Japanese could not believe the numbers because accepting them meant accepting that everything they had believed about aerial combat, about the Zero's superiority, about the importance of pilot spirit, was wrong. The numbers were real, and they were catastrophic. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.